This episode of the Practice of Therapy podcast is brought to you by Blueprint Health. Find out more by going to practiceoftherapy.com/Blueprint Health. And also it is brought to you by TherapyNotes. And you can find out more about them by going to practiceoftherapy.com/TherapyNotes. Hello, I'm Gordon Brewer, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy podcast, where we explore the business and clinical sides of running a private practice. I'm Gordon Brewer, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy podcast. And this is episode number 217 of the podcast. That's hard to believe. But anyway, welcome. Glad you're joining me for the podcast. And if this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome. And if you're coming back after having listened to other episodes, glad you're back. Glad you're with me on this journey. I'm really looking forward to everyone hearing from my guests today. I had Sage Grazer and Kendall Bird, and they are the founders of the Frame Network. And the Frame is a free online community for therapists who are dedicated to advancing their careers. And so we have a really good conversation about how they started this and their goals for this. One of the things I know that I was thinking about after I had talked with them was the fact that a lot of us in this space, the therapist space, we get involved in a lot of Facebook groups. And I think one of the things about that is it's good, but when those groups start to get really large, you kind of get lost in the shuffle. I know even for my one of my groups that I've got, the Google Workspace for Therapists Facebook group, has gotten really large. And so there's just a lot of conversation there. It can be kind of overwhelming to kind of go through all of that. And so one of the things about the network that the community they've created is that it's a membership community, and it's you really can get more specific help there, and it's easier way to navigate, I think. So anyway, looking forward to you hearing from Sage and Kendall and just hearing their story about how they started this platform, this new platform that's out there for therapists. Before we get to them, though, I want to let you know about several, at least for me, exciting things. One of the things that I've done this year is kind of switched over from still doing some live webinars, but one of the things that I found is that there's such a demand for having good resources for people that I wanted to start doing some automated webinars. So I've done that. And one of the most popular webinars that I've done has been the one on using Google Workspace in your private practice. And so I've put it up there as an automated webinar, which means you get to pick the time you want to watch it. And it's a free 1-hour webinar which is a good overview of just really kind of helping you understand how you might use Google Workspace in your practice. So if you'll go over to practiceoftherapy.com/webinars, you can find that along with another webinar. And I'll give you a heads up here. Probably by the time this episode comes out, I'll have a third webinar up there, but I've got another webinar that's up there on scaling your practice. And really the focus of that webinar is about moving from solo practice to group practice. I think one of the things that a lot of folks have experienced this past year is that we've gotten really busy. And I'm hearing from people having practices that are full. And so one of the next kind of logical steps of growing your practice is to begin to bring on other therapists in your practice. And that may or may not be a good fit for you. But anyway, this webinar where I teamed up with my good friend, Dr. David Hall, we put this webinar on together on, and it's called Scaling Without Failing. And so it's just an introduction to what what sort of transformation tips you might need for starting and growing a group practice. So we kind of go over some of those. And I've got another free webinar coming out here. We have it up and running, hopefully by the time this episode comes out. And it's going to be on accepting insurance or using third-party payers within your practice. I know there's a lot of questions about that come out for people of whether they should consider taking insurance in their practice or not. And this webinar kind of goes over the things that, at least in my view, that you need to think about in accepting third-party payments. My practice is an insurance-based practice, and I'm glad I made that decision. And so I had a little bit of anxiety over making that decision, but in the long run, I'm really feeling like I'm serving our clients well by offering them the opportunity to accept their insurance, at least some insurances anyway. So you can check that out as well. It'll be up on that same page, practiceoftherapy.com/webinars. And you can see all of our current free webinars that you can take part in. And they're automated webinars, so you get to pick your time and do a time that's convenient for you. So be sure and check that out. So before I get to my conversation with Sage and Kendall, I'd love for you to hear from our sponsors. And those are Blueprint Health, which is a measurement-based system or platform for you to really track what you're doing in your practice. And also TherapyNotes. TherapyNotes is the leading electronic health record system for mental health providers, and they're who I use in my practice. But love for you to hear more about them now. You know, as your practice grows, the systems and processes you have in place will keep your practice running smoothly. That's why it's important to have an electronic health record system that is specific to mental health providers. TherapyNotes is a complete practice management system with everything you need to manage patient records, schedule appointments, meet with patients remotely, create rich documentation, and bill insurance all right at your fingertips. Their streamlined software is accessible wherever and whenever you need it. They're who I use in my practice. And did I mention that they are one of the top-rated EHRs for mental health providers? Their support is also second to none. So be sure to check them out at practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes. And be sure to use the promo code Gordon, just GORDON, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. That's therapynotes.com. And this episode is also brought to you by Blueprint Health. You know, one of the best ways to serve clients in your practice is through measurement-based outcomes. In fact, more and more third-party payers, aka insurance companies, are demanding measurable outcomes. And with more and more emphasis on good mental health, having a way to measure your outcomes just makes sense. Introducing Blueprint, the measurement-based care platform that administers, scores, and charts hundreds of symptom rating scales to give clinicians deeper insights into treatment progress. Ultimately, by helping behavioral health providers to grow top-line practice revenue, increase clinician satisfaction, and deliver more effective care. So be sure and check them out by going to practiceoftherapy.com/blueprint health. And by going to that URL, you can also get your first month free. Again, that's practiceoftherapy.com/blueprint health. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome again to the podcast. And I'm real glad and excited for you to meet Sage Grazer and Kendall Bird, who are the co-founders of the Frame Network. And where you're going to learn about that. When I started kind of researching and learning about it, I think this is just going to be one of those platforms that people are going to be really excited about. So, Sage and Kendall, welcome.
Thank you.
So, as I start with everyone, why don't you each kind of tell a little bit of your backstory and about your journey and how you've landed where you've landed?
I'm a therapist myself. I'm an LCSW in California. And, I went into therapy because I had had really positive experiences with therapy when I was growing up. And it made me want to become a therapist and be that person for other teenagers who are struggling. And, I went about it, got my degree, started my practice, was really excited, got licensed, and then realized that when I signed up to be a therapist, I was also signing up to be a business owner and also had to figure out how to market my practice and do my finances and figure out Los Angeles city taxes and all these things that I wasn't prepared for and wasn't trained for. And I found that really overwhelming. And I had a really nice, supportive, group of peers at the time, but really didn't have a lot of guidance about how to market my practice or do those parts of it that I wasn't trained for at all. And when I reconnected with Kendall, she was looking for a therapist herself. And I was telling her what it's like to be a therapist and how hard it is to get your business going when you're not trained as a marketer. And that's kind of where our paths started to recross because we actually are childhood friends, which I failed to mention in the beginning of that part of the story.
Yeah. I think, so we grew up next door to each other for everyone listening. And I also started going, this is Kendall. I started going to therapy when I was 12 or 13. They found out that I was dyslexic and I was having confidence issues. And I also had a really positive experience with my therapist, but I took a different career path after college. I was terrified of standardized testing and did not want to go to a master's program. So I actually went into the tech field. So I worked at companies like Google, YouTube, and Snapchat, really focused on marketing, product marketing, and on the business side. And our stories reconnected. As Sage said, I'd moved back to LA. I was living in New York and was looking for a new therapist that sort of understood the craziness of the tech world. That experience was very frustrating to find that therapist, and it led me to reconnect with Sage. And from my perspective, what kind of blew my mind was like my whole life I've thought about therapists in the context of helping me with my problems. And I never thought about them as human beings outside of therapy and people who have businesses and who don't actually have a lot of business training that's offered in their master's program. And I didn't think it was fair. I just felt like these people have dedicated their lives to helping others. It's can be a very emotionally draining job. It's really time consuming, and that it's not fair that they're not getting the resources that other kinds of doctors are. And I think that was ultimately the reason that we decided to start our company, was to provide resources to therapists.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And that's what I love to hear is just how people have landed where they've landed. And that's so cool that you guys started out as little girls. Can I say that? Little girls being little, just friends, and how it's kind of gotten you to this place. And you're exactly right, Kendall. I think that's one of the reasons that I started this podcast and the practice of therapies, was just knowing that we get a lot of great clinical training as clinicians, but we never really learn the business side of things. And that's just an important piece, especially if you're going into private practice. I think people going into agency work don't need it quite as much, but I think it's still information they need to have, is to understand the workings. So, yeah. So tell us about your new venture. It might not be that new. How long have you guys been working on this together?
It's been maybe 2 years. It's crazy because time just has no meaning.
It's been almost 4 years, I think.
Oh my goodness.
No.
It has, because we started in 2018.
I have a very distinct memory of us being in an office together and Sage being like, I think this virus thing's getting pretty bad. And I was like, it's fine. And then it completely impacted all of so our lives, but also mental health and the way therapists practice.
Right.
So we launched during COVID, and what this is it's a free online community for therapists. And I think what we did was we identified a need that therapists, it's very isolating. We also came up with this idea sort of pre-COVID. So it was kind of wild that it just became more exacerbated during the pandemic. But that therapists needed a place to connect, which Sage can get into a little bit more, but we wanted to have our own spin on the community as well. And so we offer a lot of different free services and opportunities in the community that we'd love to get into. I don't know, Sage, if you want to sort of give your perspective of the community from a therapist to other therapists.
Well, when Kendall and I reconnected, and we were talking about, I was telling her about what it's like to be a therapist, sharing that there are a lot of online groups that can get really overwhelming because the groups are so massive and some of the people in there aren't as supportive as, you'd like them to be amongst each other. They kind of, there's just a sense of people being more judgmental, and it creates an environment where you don't really want to ask questions or be vulnerable to say, this is something I'm trying to figure out in my practice, or show that you don't know everything, because you don't want to get somebody on their soapbox, telling you how you're failing everything, failing miserably. So we wanted to create a community that would be a little more intimate and be a place where people could have, respectful, healthy communication and still be able to disagree, because I think that's so important, and have diversity of opinion, but do it in a way that, again, is more supportive and respectful and educating each other, as opposed to berating or belittling people. And having a successful practice is also, in private practice, it can be so isolating. And so it's really necessary to have a good community and a network of people that you can reach out to for support, whether it's clinical support or business advice or referrals, or, what kind of crisis, hotline do you tend to refer your clients to, or just things that, might be not certain when you're leaving your graduate program and then you move to a new city and you want to know what the resources are there.
Yes, and that is so needed. You're exactly right, because this this whole space can be very isolating, and as we all learned through COVID, I think now that hopefully we're on the tail end of it as we're recording this, and that's although it's going to be around for a while, I think, but that you're right, that not to badmouth any Facebook communities, because I've got one myself. They can get overwhelming, and particularly some of the larger ones. There's just so many people, and the other problem too, which I think you guys are addressing, is that sometimes you have a specific problem, and it just gets lost in the thread, and you're asking questions, and it's just a stroke of luck if you get answered, or that sort of thing. And so you're not really, you have to kind of rely on what Facebook lets people see, kind of thing.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
yeah, I can really relate to that.
Yeah.
And having posted things and then trying to figure out and sift between all these different notifications and see if my post got responded to, or track things down in a way that feels more anxiety provoking than supportive at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. And I think I think those of us in this field are kind of recognizing that we need to kind of do things differently and have a different way of connecting and networking and getting that support. So I was real excited to find out about you guys. So yeah, let's dig into the kind of the nuts and bolts of this and tell folks about, to kind of, I know it's a lot to put into a short time period, but what's kind of the A to Z of your network?
Yeah. So I think, so as Sage mentioned, the real heart of it is just it's a place to connect and ask questions. We have therapists that are sharing client referrals on there. They're asking for resources like, hey, do you guys have a nutritionist for my client? Because you'd love to offer these resources. I'd say what's a really exciting thing about our community that we think is a little different than others is, so first of all, we have lunch and learns and webinars, which, is But we love to pick topics that are sort of like, hard to get information on, or like really things that are relevant into what the therapist is going through, the modern therapist. So for example, we have a lot of education around how to create a secondary source of income, a passive income, and how to leverage your your therapy license in more ways than just treating clients. Another thing, like we picked topics, like last week we did a webinar with a registered sexologist and licensed therapist on how to talk about sex with your clients, because that seems to be a topic that a lot of communities don't get into, and you don't have a ton of training. So we love to pick lunch and learn topics that are just what the community is asking for and really top of mind. And I think another thing that we do that's really interesting, and I'm very passionate about because I've, been working in marketing roles for the last 15 years, is we offer different ways for therapists to sort of like market themselves in the modern world. So whether that's like matching you with an Instagram influencer or having you write a blog post for Frame, because we get a lot of views on that, or we even will place therapists in opportunities to be quoted in a press article as a mental health expert. But I think what you probably can agree with is like the modern therapist has got to get their name out there in ways where clients are looking for it. And sometimes that's social media, sometimes that's in a press article. And we're just trying to sort of like offer opportunities for you guys to get out there and put your name out there.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think that's marketing is one of the most intimidating things to a lot of therapists, of being able to get their name out there. And you're correct. Times have changed so much about the ways that you do that. So, yeah. So digging a little deeper, what's the format of the network and the community, and how does all that work?
Yeah, I mean, you just go to our site and sign up, and there is an approval process because we want to make sure, check your credentials. We really want this to be a place for therapists, not, we don't want anyone thinking that random people are jumping in there. And then you kind of just get into the community, and you'll explore different rooms. Like we have a client referrals room, a general advice room. Frame opportunities is where you'll be able to see the things I just mentioned around the marketing opportunities, et cetera. And then we have like an education section where you can get resources and sign up for lunch and learns and webinars.
Wow. That's great. That's great.
Am I missing anything, Sage? I don't know.
No, I think that's a good way to explain it. And, you can also, something that some of the other therapists have been really enjoying too, is that you can directly message anybody in the community. I mean, meaning therapist to therapist. And so, if I want to make sure that this person is taking new clients, or, that they're open to taking somebody who's engaging in self-harm, and I didn't see that on their profile, I can message them directly. And that's also that's another unique way to connect with therapists in a way that also doesn't feel like you're reaching out. That's in a way that's too personal. It's still professional, but you can also connect one-to-one.
Right. Right. So what sort of topics are you noticing, for lack of a better word, what's trending right now?
For therapists?
Yes.
I mean, I think that burnout is something that I'm hearing a lot about from therapists across the spectrum, in terms of new therapists and therapists that have been in practice for a long time. I imagine that has something to do with the pandemic, and we're all, even non-therapists, are feeling a little burnt out on things. But I think as therapists, we've gone through the pandemic as well as helped people through the pandemic, and didn't really necessarily have a chance to just process it ourselves. So I think that might be kind of coming to a head for a lot of providers who are also wanting to just take a real vacation, actually, and maybe go somewhere or do something that feels different than a staycation, or something that doesn't necessarily feel as rejuvenating, and a lot of us too, especially in the first year of the pandemic, just worked kind of nonstop because there wasn't any reason not to. You weren't traveling and you weren't doing things. And that's something that's important to make people aware of, or therapists aware of, that they need to be able to schedule that time in for themselves. And there's a big high demand too of people looking for therapy. And so a lot of therapists are getting their caseloads are getting really full, and they're just needing to kind of put the brakes on a little bit.
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I'm just again, a universal message across the board that I'm hearing from people across the country and across the world really is that practices are getting full. And so, yeah, the one thing about that is with the marketing piece, you have to market a little bit differently in that I don't think there's a lack of clients out there, but just making sure that you're marketing in a way so people can find you.
I think we hear that a lot. I think there's a lot of conversation too around attracting your dream client or ideal client, because you're getting all these calls and you're like, this isn't the right fit for my practice. And that's really frustrating. And so we see conversations. We also help with resources about like how to really crystallize the way you advertise yourself or talk about your services on your website or on a profile, on a directory, making that really clear. And we've talked about, what else you can add to your profile or website. We have another opportunity for therapists where we'll help you sort of make like an interesting marketing video where you're sort of talking about your specialty or niche for 5 minutes. But really just to sort of like connect with the modern client is like they really want to like learn a little bit about you and what your like specialty and niche is.
Yeah, that's very, very true. So, well, what else would folks find interesting about all of this?
A lot of therapists want to add a video to their website or profile. And I think that sometimes people, for lack of a better phrase, shoot themselves in the foot when they record a video and it's not necessarily, they don't feel natural on camera and they, maybe don't come off as they would, of course, in person. And I think one of the things that we also do is we have a team, and we actually help therapists make a video that showcases their skill and their personality, because therapists are originally trained, to be a blank slate, and there's still plenty of reason for that. And, you still want to be able to show up that way with clients, but also clients are recognizing that therapists are human beings and they want to see a little personality. And they also know that you have a personality. So they're curious. And it doesn't mean you have to tell people your personal secrets, but just showing that you have, your human aspects. So I think that's something that we do that's unique, is that we actually help therapists create a video that really showcases themselves. And then we also promote that and share that with a potential client audience so they can actually see and get an idea of like what kind of things this therapist can help me with.
For example, like, one of the things that's really interesting, or a lot of people are talking about in the community, is trauma and having a trauma-informed approach. But trauma is a very hard concept for clients to understand. And I think a lot of people don't realize that they're experiencing trauma. We've talked about this before. So when they're looking for a therapist, they're not, if you're like, oh, I specialize in trauma as a therapist, they're not going to come to you necessarily, because most people don't realize they've had or as I've learned, little T trauma. So we've talked a lot about, what are the best ways, like I said, to have a clear messaging that explains what that is and not use overly clinical terms. And then also through these videos, we have a way we guide our therapists to sort of talk about it in a way that's super relatable. We'll even poll our Instagram community and be like, what are the 5 things you want to know about trauma? And then let the therapist answer that question in the video. And we think we're seeing that it's getting such better results for therapists that are trying to attract clients or build their brand, because it's not just like, hey, I'm Susie and I see patients on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's like actually showing people what you might be like in a session. So I think that's been really interesting for me too, as a marketer, working with a therapist, because I feel like Sage and I both represent, like, she's the therapist, I am the client. And Sage will say, like, I remember we had this almost like a joke. Like, I think one of Sage's colleagues had said, like, I specialize in sleep hygiene, which is like something like a therapist term. And I was like, you can't say that on your website. Like, people like me will read that and be like, that sounds like someone's like a dirty, like doesn't clean their. So like, it's just sort of interesting to see sort of like the clinical way things are described and versus like how a client would understand that.
Yeah, that is so true. And I think one of the, when in my work in consulting with other therapists, particularly those that are getting started, is that I think one of the most important pages on any website is your about page. But I tell them, your about page isn't about you; it's about your client, and being able to put it in words that just resonate with your ideal client. And not to get into all this clinical mumbo jumbo and degrees and credentials and all that kind of stuff, because, not that stuff isn't important. Most people just really don't care. They just want to know how you're going to be able to help them.
Yeah. And people also don't necessarily, I mean, I don't need to tell therapists this, but they don't necessarily like want to label themselves as having a problem yet. Mm-hmm. And so it's really hard, like on a Psychology Today profile, it's like, I specialize in addiction, blah, 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 blah. And they're like, it's just people. So it's just like a really interesting conversation of like the best way to present yourself. And I will say, like, I'm so proud of the community we've built, because I do think it is for like the modern therapist and for people who are just trying to adapt, like we all are, to a post-COVID world. And I think for Sage, this is her way to give back to her own community. And for me, it's sort of like a love letter, like a thank you to therapists, because it's changed my life, going to therapy.
Yeah, that is so great. So, well, Sage and Kendall, I want to be respectful of your time. Tell folks how they can get in touch with you and find out more about the frame therapy.
You can go to www.tryframe.com/therapist.
We'll have a link, as Kendall said, in the show notes for this. And also, I'll just mention here, we're going to create a pretty link.
Beautiful.
It'll be beautiful. It really will. Practiceoftherapy.com/frame. And so that'll be easy for hopefully easy for
Much
people
easier
to remember. So, but yeah. So, Sage and Kendall, any other parting thoughts?
You can also check out our social media if you're interested in seeing some of the other kinds of things that we do, which is frame.therapy on Instagram, which I think is something that's unique, and we showcase different therapists in our community as well.
Sage and Kendall, I hope we can get you back sometime. And I'm real excited to learn about this new platform and what it's offering in terms of support to those of us out there in the trenches, so to speak, and really just dealing in really the timing couldn't be better. Even though you launched it during COVID, I think it was the perfect time to help get more support during these overwhelming times, and particularly for those of us that are just getting full with our practices. Well, again, a big thanks to Kendall and Sage for being on the podcast. And, one of the things that I think we've all learned through the whole COVID pandemic is that the importance of community. And I think in many ways we kind of took it for granted. On my other podcast that I started this year, Kindness and Compassion podcast, I just had a conversation with my good friend Claire Brown, who is an Episcopal priest, and we were just talking about the importance of community and how we need to be able to connect with others in a way that kind of helps us move through some of the fear that we have. And I think particularly in private practice, for those of us that have been through the throes of starting a practice and that sort of thing, there is a bit of fear around that. And I think one of the best ways for us to learn to live with the fear is to be able to find a community that we can share and be vulnerable with. And the fact that Kendall and Sage have put together this community, I think is really exciting. And I'd invite you to go over and check them out. And if you'll go again to that URL, just www.tryframe.com therapy.com/therapist, you can try them out. And it's free to join. So it's a win-win kind of situation. So be sure and check it out. And also, I want to mention again here at the end that be sure and check out the free webinars that I've got getting up there, and more and more resources up on the Practice of Therapy, practiceoftherapy.com. And if you'll go to practiceoftherapy.com/webinars, we're starting to get a little bit of a catalog there of free learning opportunities for you on just different topics within private practice. So be sure and check that out, practiceoftherapy.com/webinars. And as always, a big thanks to our sponsors of the podcast, Blueprint Health. And if you'll go to practiceoftherapy.com/Blueprint Health, you can find out more about them and also try them out for 1 month for free just by using that URL, practiceoftherapy.com/Blueprint Health. They are a measurement-based platform for therapists to really help us be more evidence-based in our clinical work. And also be sure and check out TherapyNotes, therapynotes.com, or you can go to practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes. And if you go there and want to try them out, use the promo code Gordon, just GORDON, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. So a big thanks to both of those organizations for sponsoring the podcast and helping us keep it out there. So thanks to them. So folks, thanks for joining me for this particular episode. Be sure and take time to follow us and subscribe or subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it, whether it be on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Spotify or Google Podcasts or Amazon or any place that you listen to your podcast. You should be able to find us there, and take time to give us a review and give us a star or two. So take care, folks, and I'm looking forward to you being back with me next week. You have been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, part of the PsychCraft network of podcasts. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to receive the free private practice startup guide at practiceoftherapy.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. If you need a professional, you should find the right person for that.